Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Mientras trabajas duro por el éxito de tus hijos, algo que no ves los puede estar afectando. Se llama estrés tóxico. Es la manera en que el cuerpo de los niños responde a experiencias difíciles. Aprende cómo ayudarlos en first5california.com.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. It is Monday, October 10, 2016, episode 17, and I'm your host, John Bruni. Today we are honored to be joined by Dr. Daniel Twining, who is Director and Senior Fellow for Asia at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Dr. Twining previously served as a member of the U.S. Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff responsible for South Asia and regional issues in East Asia. He was policy advisor to U.S. Senator John McCain. Dr. Twining regularly writes for Foreign Policy and Nikkei, as well as occasional pieces for the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Twining also sits on the editorial board of the Asian Forum. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Twining.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
As we are nearing the November 8th US federal election, and we have just witnessed the first presidential debate between Republican candidate businessman Donald J. Trump and Democrat candidate, former First Lady, Senator and Secretary of State in the first Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, what are your thoughts of the candidates and their respective public positions on Asia?
So, first, there's been a 70-year track record of bipartisan American support for our leadership in Asia, for our alliances here, for our economic engagement here, and I don't think that would change, even though Trump has staked out some different turf than Clinton on issues like the U.S.-Japan alliance, like trade with China, etc. Clinton, I think, would be, in keeping with her record as Secretary of State, very focused on this region. I think she would be more focused on it than President Obama has been. Obama wanted to pivot away from the Middle East and never found himself able to, also found himself faced with this great Russian challenge in Europe. I think Clinton would like to bring the U.S. focus even more back to this region, and I also think she would be tougher than President Obama has been on issues like revisionism in the South China Sea. Trump, it's not clear. I suspect, however, he would find if he were President of the United States, he would not want to launch a trade war with China and crack up the U.S. alliance structure. I suspect he would find his energies consumed domestically.
That would be a problem for him, wouldn't it?
It would, and it's one thing to get up and say stuff on television, right, and kind of be the showman. I think it's another if you're sitting in the Oval Office in our White House.
Yes.
You own the problems, right? You own the challenges out in the world that America has to react to, and I think you do not want to multiply them because you don't have enough bandwidth as president. So I suspect you would see more continuity in Asia despite the tone of the campaign.
During the September 26 presidential debate, Donald Trump came out swinging, stating that multilateral trade deals such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership are a bad idea. He argued that such deals export jobs to low-cost producing countries such as China and Mexico. Hillary Clinton seems to have also changed her mind on the TPP too, from supportive to doubtful. Having worked in Asia, what are your observations of US trade deals, bilateral and multilateral, and how, in your opinion, have they benefited the US in terms of general diplomacy in Asia and job creation and innovation in the US?
Okay, so that's a great question. First, to start with the end of the question, export-oriented jobs in America pay about 20% more than jobs that don't depend on export, so they pay better. Second, the U.S. exports 3 times more to its FTA partners, its free trade agreement partners, than it does to other countries. So trade agreements manifestly improve the American export outlook. Third, The US is actually a very domestically focused economy. It's not a huge trading nation in the way that a country like Singapore or Australia are, where they're exporting a huge amount of their GDP and importing it. The US sees trade agreements as really strategic tools of foreign policy, right? And so if you look, you will see that most of our trade agreements are with close friends and allies, like Australia, like South Korea, like Japan through TPP. I mean, one of the most significant components of TPP for the United States is that Japan is at the center of it. I suspect that at the end of the day, President Clinton and a Republican Congress could do a deal on TPP, and I would even venture that Donald Trump, were he to be president, rather than throwing it out the window, might simply try to reopen and renegotiate bits of it, but might come around to seeing it as in America's interest.
Okay. Trump has also suggested that US allies, including Japan and South Korea, should pay for American military protection, claiming that footing the lion's share of Northeast Asia security is contributing to America's economic problems. Can and should Japan and South Korea do more to wean themselves off US security guarantees, or, as Trump suggests, enter into a transactional relationship with them?
So I think the point about alliances is that they're not simply transactional, but they're about a shared set of interests and values that unite peoples as well as governments around common interests. Second, actually, it's cheaper to station American forces in Japan and Korea, given that they get host nation support to offset some of their expense, versus having them deployed domestically. Third, I think a President Trump, as he became increasingly briefed and aware, would understand that it's more expensive when security is eroded, leading to conflict, than it is to invest in security through vehicles like our alliance system in Asia. So in other words, even from a kind of a monetary perspective, our alliances offer quite good value for money, given that they have kept the peace in a region that has produced an economic miracle that has been very beneficial to the United States and others.
Now, there has been a number of things said about Donald Trump, not necessarily all of them good, but the one thing that I'm curious about, following on from what you've just said, can a President Trump be moved? Can his advisors actually bring him down to center? So, he may not necessarily say all the things that policy advisors would think would be on par, but he would be able to take advice from policy advisors, making sure that America has a continuity of foreign policy from one administration to the other. Do you think that's even possible?
I don't know. I would like to think, however, I would like to believe something a friend told me who knows Donald Trump a little bit. And this friend said, look, this guy, he blusters and brags before a business negotiation. I mean, this guy's a businessman. He stakes out a very extreme position before a negotiation. What he then did throughout his business career is he would go into a room, close the door, negotiate, and do the deal. And so I would say that maybe his starting proposition is not where he's going to end up, right? And it may be, for instance, on NAFTA, that he negotiates an agreement with Mexico where Mexico does a bit more immigration enforcement on its side of the border. And then Trump walks away and says, see, we got a better deal. We're going to keep NAFTA, and the Mexicans are going to do a better job policing Central American immigrants moving across their border. Let us see. But what people say is this guy does have a track record as a businessman. He's someone who wants to do deals. He's not just someone who postures. And of course, the difference between running as a candidate and governing a country is that you have to stop posturing and actually start making decisions and doing deals.
That would be a shock to much of the mainstream media who have been brought up on stories of Trump being some sort of political ogre that we have to fear. I mean, it would be a real turnaround if we could actually see something different, another side of him, which will fill us with more hope that there is a credible outcome to anything that he puts forward if he's president.
I don't want to raise your hopes too much. I do think this guy, what Americans like about him, his voting base, which is not a majority, but which is maybe 30, 35, 40% of voters, his voting base likes the fact that he is not a career politician, that he's not a product of Washington, not a product of capital politics, and they think he will come in and bring a fresh look to government. I mean, Americans see a country where economic growth is not as robust as we would like it to be. They see a country that is engaged in a much bigger set of competitions over security with Russia and China abroad, obviously ISIS in the Middle East. They see a much greater degree of economic competition coming from Asia and other regions. And they believe that the U.S. political class has not responded to that. They think the world is more dangerous and that America is not as prosperous. And they like the idea of an outsider coming in and shaking things up.
Yeah. Are there valid criticisms among America's Asian allies regarding President Obama's pivot to Asia? We mentioned it earlier. From what I understand, there have been quite a few people saying that it wasn't that much of a pivot. I mean, really, the Americans haven't moved away from the Middle East and Central Asia in the way that people were expecting. Is that true?
So elements of the pivot are ongoing, like deploying 60% of America's naval assets in this region. That's something that changes over time, but that is continuing. Like the modest U.S. troop presence in Darwin on a rotational basis, like these new basing arrangements we've negotiated in the Philippines. There are elements that are happening that maybe aren't very sexy, but that are ongoing, like hopefully TPP, if we can get to the finish line with the big trade deal. Yeah. Otherwise, though, I think the criticism that the U.S. has not paid full attention to this region is correct. And I think a new president would want to rectify that. Now, to a certain extent, as an American, you go around the world, and everywhere you go, people say, you're not paying enough attention to us. You go to Latin America, they say, you're neglecting us, we're your backyard. Okay. You go to the Middle East, they say, the region's a mess, why don't you fix it? You go to Europe, they say there's a problem with Russia, Brexit, etc. We need more guidance and help. So the U.S. always struggles to get the balance right. But I will say that we're a Pacific power. We understand that the center of economic and strategic gravity is shifting to this region. And I'm 100% confident we'll remain very committed.
Interestingly, while China came in for a particular grilling from Trump during the debate, Clinton was far more diplomatic and chose not to engage the China card. However, there are people in the Democratic camp who aren't necessarily convinced that China is playing a fair game in terms of trade or strategy, because China views trade as a subset of strategic influence. Was this a clever positioning by Clinton, or is there no strong view or opinion among Democrats on how to deal with China?
So I'm a Republican, so I'm not the best person to ask. Okay. However, yeah. For her, though, she was quite tough in the debate in calling out China for its cyber attacks on U.S. government institutions and on U.S. corporate assets and headquarters. And so she did sort of say that's going to change. Yep. When I'm president, we are going to harden our defenses and we're going to take a much more robust posture against these sort of attacks. I think more broadly, certainly on the Democratic side of the House, Bernie Sanders, her primary opponent for the Democratic nomination, got 13 million votes. She got 14 million. So he wasn't far behind, running on this overtly protectionist platform. In some ways more protectionist than Trump, saying that America had lost out through free trade agreements, etc. I think there's a big job, whoever wins, to do in talking to the American people quite openly about American leadership in this globalized economy and the fact that it does underwrite our prosperity, but at the same time that we also have to enforce trade rules, including against China, which does not at all have a level playing field in terms of its domestic market and access for foreign companies to Chinese consumers. So I think you'll hear more about fair trade, especially with China. And I hope, if it's President Clinton, she can pitch TPP as being part of the solution, because that is about raising trade standards in ways that actually would benefit American economic advantages.
That's actually quite an interesting point, because just a moment ago you said that Bernie Sanders was nipping at Hillary Clinton's heels, which of course he was, and he was much more protectionist, and he did put that out there. So how much did Clinton have to change in terms of what she really believes is in America's best strategic interest to ensure that she won the Democratic primaries in the end? Because she had to have shifted quite significantly. Sanders was really very close.
He was. On TPP specifically, she had said when she was Secretary of State that this was a very important deal. But the deal had not been finalized. She hadn't seen the terms of the deal when she was Secretary of State, because the agreement was only finalized in 2015, right?
Correct.
So there are people on both sides, not just the Democratic side, but also the Republican side, who have grievances about this or that provision in the deal. It's the nature of an 11-country deal, that not everyone's going to be happy with it in any given country. I suspect that whoever is U.S. president, whether it's her or Trump, but particularly if it's her, will pivot back to this. Maybe let the fever cool for a year or two, maybe renegotiate if there's some very problematic chapter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, maybe try to open that up and do some tinkering with our trade partners. But at the end of the day, the U.S. has never walked away from a free trade agreement. Once we've gotten this far, we've always ratified it and enacted it. And so I would look at the historical record and bet that we'll still get to the finish line on TPP, but I think we'll have to be patient. It may take a few more years.
Okay. The one country that was not mentioned by either candidate during their debate was India. This is curious. President Obama has steadily courted the Indian government as part of his long-term strategy to solidify a quadrilateral bloc consisting of the US, Japan, India and Australia, ostensibly to limit and contain Chinese power. It is also curious since tensions between India and long-term enemy Pakistan over Kashmir recently flared up, suggesting that one of the first international crises that a new US president may face will be to cool tensions between these two nuclear-armed countries. Your thoughts?
So I think India will be a source of security in South Asia rather than insecurity, and more broadly in East Asia. The more it engages with this part of the world, India will be a helpful stabilizer of regional security affairs. I think with Pakistan, Pakistan has a history of sponsoring terrorism against India, and that is a card that is played out. This new India is much stronger, more assertive under Prime Minister Modi, and he has made clear that India is not going to tolerate this death by 1,000 cuts set of terrorist attacks against Indian civilian targets, given the Pakistani security services' special relationship with some terrorist groups. So the Pakistanis are in a difficult position of essentially having had their bluff called, in the sense that India is reacting. India previously had a strategy of strategic restraint in which it didn't react to these provocations. Modi is now reacting, and so the generals in Pakistan are going to have to reassess their options accordingly. On India more broadly, I think it's very important to the future of the United States, not just in Asia and not just for transactional reasons. I mean, you mentioned balancing China, but we also think about Indian Ocean sea lane security, the world's energy superhighway across those Indian Ocean sea lanes, that India can help police those. We think about defeating violent extremism and terrorism in all its forms. India is a country that suffered hugely from extremist attacks. We think about helping juice economic growth in East Asia and in the world. India is now the world's biggest, fastest growing big economy, and increasingly will be a contributor to trade and investment flows, both in and out, that will benefit our companies in America and Australia and elsewhere, and help pull many more Indians out of poverty, in the same way that China's globalization has pulled hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty. So we think there's an important set of stories in India. Of course, India is also a huge democracy. And we think that that matters, that we can show people in Africa, people in poor parts of Latin America and elsewhere, that you can develop a modern economy under democratic institutions. Because I think there's an alternative view that, the Chinese strongman approach is more effective. I don't think that's true. And I think the Asian experience, not just in India, but in Indonesia, in Japan, in South Korea, in Taiwan, shows that economic growth is better sustained under rule of law and in open societies.
My experience in Africa has suggested that the amount of Chinese investment, especially in the Horn of Africa region, I had to do some work in Ethiopia at some point, it's both welcomed and reviled. And it's because of that very thing that you just mentioned. There's that top-down approach to things, which appears to make China a much more effective actor in terms of dispensing aid and doing things quickly. But of course, there's a qualitative issue. If you get the Chinese engineers to create a bridge, the local Ethiopians used to joke that, it depends on, how much money the Chinese are prepared to put into that particular project, because the bridge may not be there in 12 months' time because of the lack of the quality of the build. But India has got some significant capacity problems as well. I mean, you mentioned that India can be the driver, and I'm not suggesting that it can't be, but what I am saying is, under current circumstances, when you look at the way that India develops its own internal dynamics, and you look at the way that China internalizes its creation of its own space, one is moving at warp speed in one way and has a clear vision of what to do and what the outcome is. The other one is kind of messy, kind of higgledy-piggledy, perhaps the only thing that I can say about the Indian example is that if you look at the military, they're very organized, but the government, it's a federated structure. You've got communists, you've got Democrats, you've got right-wing caste people doing all kinds of things to each other. How can a structure that is so hodgepodge be something that can create that space that China has successfully created from the top-down communist strategy. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So India, it's very unfathomable, partly because there are 30-odd Indian states. And actually, India in some ways is more like Europe, where it's a mix of nationalities and ethnicities and language groups, right? It just all happens to be bundled into one country. And to the extent it looks like a hodgepodge, it's maybe because, democracy is the only way to govern.
Yep.
Really what is the most pluralistic society in the world. I mean, I don't think there is another country as diverse as India. So the answer, perhaps, on governance is to look at some of the states. Prime Minister Modi was chief minister of Gujarat for almost a decade. Gujarat grew as fast as China during that period and is an industrialized state, essentially, with high levels of education and socioeconomic indicators. You compare that with a very poor part of India like Uttar Pradesh, which has 200 million people, a big agricultural kind of village economy, not a lot of industry. Socioeconomic indicators there are like the poorest parts of Africa. Yeah. And so the answer is multiple realities exist within India at once. And what we have found is that reformist chief ministers in the states, in places like Karnataka, in places like Tamil Nadu, in places like Gujarat, even in places like Bihar, which is a much poorer place, reformist ministers who have produced economic growth and some modicum of good governance have been rewarded at the polls, whereas bad chief ministers in their parties who have done patronage politics and that sort of thing have not been rewarded at the polls. Indians are aspirational. They want growth and better governance. And India's democratic structure arguably means it can deliver them in a way that China's top-down structure cannot, right? I mean, China has had a great success rapidly industrializing, but for China to make the economic transition to a consumer-based, services-based innovation economy, this top-down structure I don't think will work.
There is one thing that I need to raise with regard to India, and recently you may know that Karnataka and Tamil Nadu have been having water issues themselves. Because of the inability of the central government to really intervene in a way that is satisfactory to both states, and both states are very angry at the national government as well as angry at each other, because of the quote-unquote democratic way of doing things in India, how do you think issues like water scarcity will play out in this new emerging Indian dynamic power that you speak of?
Water scarcity is a big issue in South Asia. I mean, India has the additional complication that the headwaters of its great rivers don't lie in India, they lie in Tibet, right under Chinese control. Yeah. So there's a set of issues around water in India. The government basically provides free water to farmers who then pump too much of it and waste it, right? They don't irrigate carefully. Etc. So India is going to have to do water reform. India also is looking at some very dangerous destabilizations from climate change. Should the sea levels rise, I mean, much of the Indian population does live in coastal regions. They would be very badly affected, including places like Calcutta and West Bengal, which are very densely populated. Prime Minister Modi, this is quite interesting, India has just joined this Paris Accord on reducing emissions targets to try to fight climate change. And Prime Minister Modi actually wrote a book about this, about climate, saying that India, sort of in a kind of a Hindu, almost like a Hindu mystical way, saying that India has a duty to care for the planet and to develop in a sustainable way. Right. And this is very interesting because this is a totally different rationale than you hear about China, which has terribly polluted its rivers, its food system, has desperate shortages of agriculture, of clean water, has desertification, and all these environmental frictions. Modi has seen what has happened in China with this untamed development and actually has said he does not want India to develop that way. That might mean a bit of slower growth, but it probably means a lot more things like clean energy inputs, the kind that didn't exist when China was industrializing. India could benefit from solar, nuclear, civilian energy. But to have a leader of a country that has so much to do in terms of economic growth and development, but is also mindful of the climate and environmental impacts, I think is actually quite encouraging. But water is going to be a big friction point.
Dr. Twining, I know that you're pressed for time, so just one final question. I'm having way too much fun with this. Now, there is one thing that raises its head, and that is, the whole water scarcity issue. We talk about it at a local level, we talk about it at a national level, we also talk about it at an international level. So if we take away the South China Sea as a massive strategic issue for the United States and global stability generally, do you think that water scarcity and China's control of the headwaters up in the Tibetan area will be a thorn in the side of India, Pakistan, and China. So we end up having a trilateral instability which could actually manifest into a proper land war.
It's a very interesting thesis. I mean, I don't know if it plays out in terms of interstate conflict or if it plays out more in terms of domestic unrest and destabilization and lower levels of economic growth. Let us see, but I think it's something to watch, these non-traditional security issues. I think people think that, fighter jets and naval destroyers and submarines are very sexy, right? And people imagine these kind of 20th century military conflicts playing out in the 21st century, whereas actually cyberspace, water, some of these other issues could actually be the domains where you see great instabilities between states and within them.
Dr. Twining, thank you very much for your time.
Delighted to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We're always looking to pass on the most interesting information on international relations and security to our social media followers. And until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.